Your wife's been cheating on you for 4 years. Right under your nose? And you never had a clue. How could that be, you ask? To that, I say, I don't know how it happened. My name's Jameson. I'm 44 and I've been married for 19 years, or at least I thought I was. My wife, Carmen, is 41. We have 2 kids. Richard, who's 15, and Ella, who's 11. From the outside, we looked like the perfect family. That's what I believed, too. It all started a couple of weeks ago on a regular Thursday evening. Carmen came home from work looking stressed. She's not one for drama, so seeing her like that made me uneasy. She didn't say much, just mumbled something about needing a few things. The next thing I knew, she was packing clothes into an overnight bag. What's going on, Carmen? I asked, trying to sound calm. She didn't answer or even look at me. She just zipped up the bag and walked out the door. Richard was in his room with his headphones on, completely unaware, and Ella was at my mom's for a sleepover. I was left alone in the silence, trying to figure out what had just happened. I called her, texted her, nothing. Not a single reply. The next day, I reached out to her parents. After several tries, her mom finally answered and said, Carmen's with us. She just needs some space. Please, Jameson, give her time. Be patient and understanding. Patience isn't really my thing. What kind of space? I pressed, but her mom dodged the question. Just give her time, she repeated. Time for what? She wouldn't say. By Saturday, the kids started asking questions. Richard wanted to know if we were fighting. Ella asked if Mom was mad at me. What could I say? Mom's at Grandma and Grandpa's. She just needs a little break. I hated lying to them, but I didn't have a choice. By Sunday, I'd had enough. I put the kids in the car and drove 3 hours to her parents' house. I didn't tell anyone we were coming. They weren't answering my calls, so why bother? When we got there, her dad opened the door. He looked about as happy to see me as a cat in a dog park. Jameson, now's not a good time, he said, blocking the doorway. Carmen's not ready to talk. Not ready to talk? She's been gone for days. The kids deserve answers. I deserve answers. He sighed and stepped outside, shutting the door behind him. Jameson, it's complicated. Try me, I said, crossing my arms. He hesitated, glanced back at the house, then said, She's been under a lot of stress. Stress doesn't make you pack a bag and ghost your family. I snapped. What aren't you telling me? Jameson, he started, but his wife called him back inside. We'll call you soon, he said before closing the door in my face. The kids were quiet during the drive home. Ella eventually fell asleep, but Richard kept looking at me like he wanted to say something. When I finally asked him, he said, Did Mom leave us? That hit me like a punch in the gut. No, I lied. She'll be back. But in my head, all I could think was, what if she's not? A week went by, and Carmen was still gone. No calls, no texts, nothing. Her parents kept stonewalling me with the same, be patient, excuse every time I called. The kids were struggling. Ella cried herself to sleep 2 nights in a row, and Richard barely spoke to me. Felt like we were all waiting for a bomb to drop. That bomb finally dropped on Tuesday morning. I was at work, staring at my computer, when my phone buzzed. It was Carmen's sister, Beatrix. We weren't close. She's always in the middle of someone else's drama, but something told me to pick up. Jameson, she said quietly, I think you should know. There's been an accident. My stomach twisted. What kind of accident? It's the man she was seeing. He's dead. I froze. What did you just say? She sighed, like she didn't want to spell it out. Carmen was having an affair, Jameson. For years. The guy she was seeing died in a car accident last week. That's why she's at Mom and Dad's. She's a mess. Felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. An affair? Years? All the little things I'd ignored suddenly made sense. Late nights at work, her new obsession with how she looked, the mysterious girls' weekends. I wanted to scream, punch something, do anything, but I just sat there, gripping my phone. Who was he? I finally asked, my voice barely above a whisper. His name was Levi, Beatrix said. I don't know much about him. He worked with her, I think. But Jameson, I'm sorry. I thought you should know. I hung up without saying a word. My hands were shaking as I dialed Carmen's number for the 100th time. This time, she answered. Honey, she said, her voice hoarse. She sounded like she'd been crying for days. Don't honey me, I snapped. How long has this been going on? There was a long pause before she whispered. For years. 4 years of lying and sneaking around. Couldn't believe it. I didn't want to believe it. And you didn't think I deserved to know? You didn't think the kids deserved to know? I was going to tell you, she said weakly. But then Levi, her voice cracked. I didn't know how. Unbelievable, I muttered, running a hand through my hair. So what now, Carmen? You disappear for a week and think you can just walk back into our lives like nothing happened. I'm sorry, she said, starting to cry. I made a mistake. A terrible mistake. Please, Jameson, let me come home. Let me explain. I wanted to hang up, to slam the door on this chapter of my life and never look back. But then I thought about Richard and Ella, and how much they'd already been through. I didn't know what to do, but I was certain I couldn't make this decision over the phone. You can come back, I finally said, my voice cold and detached. But don't think for a second this is forgiven. You've got a lot of explaining to do. After hanging up, it felt like I had just invited chaos into my life, and deep down, I knew things would never be the same. Carmen returned 2 days later. I told the kids she was staying with her parents because of work stress. It wasn't the most convincing excuse, but they seemed to accept it. When she walked through the door, Richard barely glanced up from his phone. Ella, on the other hand, ran straight to her and wrapped her arms around Carmen like nothing had ever happened. Mommy, Ella cried. I missed you so much. Carmen hugged her tightly, tears rolling down her cheeks. I missed you too, sweetheart. I stood to the side, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold. When she looked over at me, her face was a mixture of guilt and fear. Jameson, she began, but I cut her off with a raised hand. Not now, I said. We'll talk after the kids go to bed. She nodded, her shoulders sinking, and for the rest of the day, we went through the motions, pretending everything was fine. Carmen made dinner, Ella chatted about school, and Richard stayed locked in his room, giving her the cold shoulder. Couldn't blame him. When the house finally settled down for the night, I found Carmen sitting on the couch, staring at her hands. As I walked in, she looked up at me, and we sat there in heavy, suffocating silence. So, I said at last, sitting across from her, let's hear it. Start from the beginning. Carmen took a shaky breath. I didn't mean for it to happen, she said. Levi, he was just a friend at first. We worked together and he was easy to talk to. But then, it turned into something more. For 4 years, I asked, my tone dripping with sarcasm. Just a little more, huh? She winced but didn't argue. I was bored, Jameson. Stuck in the same routine, work, kids, housework. Levi made me feel alive. But it was a mistake. I see that now. I was going to end it. Before or after he died? I shot back. Her face crumpled. After. When I heard about the accident, I was devastated. But it wasn't just about him. It was about everything I'd done to you and the kids. I've ruined everything, Jameson. I don't even know how to fix it. You can't, I said bluntly. Do you think you can cry your way out of this? Apologize and make it all better? You lied to me, to Richard, to Ella. You dragged this family through the mud because you were bored. Tears streamed down her face, but I was too angry and hurt to care. Do you even love me? I demanded. Or was I just part of the routine you needed to escape from? I do love you, she whispered. I've never stopped loving you. I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. You've got a funny way of showing it. She reached out as if to touch me, but I leaned back, out of her reach. Jameson, please, she begged. I want to make this right. I'll do whatever it takes. I stared at her, the woman I'd spent half my life with, and realized she felt like a stranger. You want to fix this? I said. Fine. You're staying here for the kids' sake, But don't think for a second that we're okay. You'll explain this to Richard and Ella, and then we'll see where things go. She nodded, wiping her eyes. Okay, I understand. But as I walked out of the room, leaving her in tears, one thought consumed me. There's no coming back from this. The next morning, I told Carmen it was time to come clean to the kids. I didn't want them finding out by accident or piecing together half-truths from someone else. She had to own up to her choices, no matter how much it shattered the image they had of her. After breakfast, we gathered the kids in the living room. Richard leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his face full of skepticism. Ella, however, sat cross-legged on the couch, clutching her stuffed bunny like it was her anchor. Carmen cleared her throat, her voice trembling as she began. There's something I need to tell you both. It's not easy, but you deserve to know the truth. Richard raised an eyebrow. Okay, what truth? Carmen glanced at me, and I gave her a small nod to encourage her. I made a mistake, she said. A big one. I hurt your dad and our family. Ella frowned. What do you mean, Mommy? Carmen's hands twisted nervously in her lap. I was spending time with someone who wasn't your dad. It wasn't right, and I never should have done it. Richard's eyes narrowed, his voice cutting like a blade. You mean you cheated, right? Let's just call it what it is. Carmen flinched but nodded. Yes, she whispered. I cheated. The room fell silent. Ella's face crumpled, tears welling in her eyes. Why? She asked, her voice breaking. Why would you do that? Carmen reached out to her, but Ella shrank away, burying her face in her bunny. I don't know, Carmen admitted. I was selfish. I wasn't thinking about what it would do to you or your dad. I'm so sorry, Carmen said, her voice trembling. Richard abruptly stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Sorry doesn't fix this, Mom, he snapped. You didn't just hurt Dad. You hurt all of us. Did you even think about that? Or were you too busy having fun with your friend? Richard, Carmen began, but he interrupted her, his voice rising. No, I don't want to hear it, he shouted. You messed up, and now we're the ones stuck dealing with it. Great parenting, Mom. He stormed off, slamming his bedroom door behind him. Ella let out a soft sob, and I pulled her close, wrapping an arm around her. It's going to be okay, I whispered, even though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. Carmen stayed seated, tears running down her face. She looked completely broken. I don't know how to fix this, she said quietly. I don't think I can. Then maybe it's time to stop trying to fix it, I said, my tone sharp and cold. Maybe it's time to start thinking about how we move forward. Separately. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with fear. Jameson, no. Please don't say that. I've thought about this a lot, I replied, my voice firm. And I can't see a way back from this. You didn't just break my trust, you destroyed it. I won't raise our kids in a home built on lies. For the first time, she didn't argue. She just sat there, staring down at her hands while Ella clung to me, as if I was the only solid thing in her world. That night, the house was quieter than it had ever been. Richard didn't come out of his room, not even for dinner, and Ella refused to sleep in her own bed. She insisted on staying with me, clutching her stuffed bunny like it could protect her from the storm our lives had become. Carmen stayed downstairs, sitting alone in the dark like a shadow of herself. I didn't speak to her. Couldn't. Every time I thought about what she had done, the anger surged back, fresh and sharp. The idea of us being under the same roof felt unbearable. The next morning, I made up my mind. After the kids left for school, I confronted Carmen in the kitchen. She was pouring herself a cup of coffee, her face pale and exhausted, as if she hadn't slept in days. We need to talk, I said, my voice cutting through the quiet. She turned to me slowly, her shoulders slumped, bracing herself for what was coming. Okay. I can't keep doing this, I said firmly. You being here, pretending we can fix this. It's not working. It's bad for me, it's bad for the kids. And honestly, I think it's bad for you too. Her eyes welled up with tears. Jameson, I know I messed up. No, I interrupted. You didn't just mess up. You destroyed our marriage, and I can't live like this anymore. Her hands trembled as she set down the coffee cup. What are you saying? I'm saying it's time for you to leave, I said bluntly. Go to your sisters or your parents. I don't care where, but you can't stay here. Her face crumpled, and she whispered, Jameson, please. This isn't about punishing you, I continued, cutting her off again. It's about giving everyone some space. The kids need stability, and I can't provide that with you here. She was silent for a long moment before nodding, tears streaming down her cheeks. Okay, she whispered. I'll go. I'll talk to the kids, I said. I'll tell them this is temporary, that you're staying with your sister while we figure things out. But Carmen, don't come back until you're ready to be completely honest. No more secrets. She swallowed hard, her voice breaking as she replied, I will, I promise. That evening, Carmen packed her bags. Ella cried when I told her what was happening, but Richard barely reacted. He just muttered, good, and walked away. Carmen hugged them both before she left, whispering apologies they weren't ready to accept. And then she was gone. For the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe. But as I sat alone in the quiet house, a hollow ache spread through my chest. Divorce felt inevitable, but the thought of tearing our family apart filled me with dread. I wanted to hate her, to shut the door on that chapter of my life and never look back. But I wasn't sure if I could. All I knew was that I had to keep going, for Richard, for Ella, and for myself. 3 days after Carmen left, my phone buzzed late at night. I almost ignored the buzzing phone, assuming it was just another spam call. But something made me check. It was a text from her. Jameson, I need to talk to you. Please, I owe you the truth. I stared at the message for a long time, caught between wanting to delete it and needing to know everything. In the end, my curiosity won out. I replied, agreeing to meet her the next evening at a nearby cafe. Meeting on neutral ground felt safer. When I arrived at the cafe, she was already there, sitting in a corner booth with a cup of coffee in front of her. Untouched. She looked up as I approached, her face pale and her eyes swollen from crying. She barely resembled the woman I used to know. I slid into the seat across from her, keeping my arms crossed. You said you wanted to talk, I said, my tone flat. So talk. She swallowed hard, twisting her hands in her lap. Jameson, I'm so sorry for everything. I've been horrible to you, to the kids, to our family. I don't even know where to start. Start at the beginning, I said curtly. How did this happen? How did you go from being my wife to whatever this is? She flinched but nodded. It started 5 years ago, she admitted. Levi and I worked together. At first, it was just friendly conversations. He was charming, Jameson. He gave me attention in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. And I didn't? I asked sharply. It's not that, she said quickly. You were always a good husband, a great dad. But I don't know. I got bored, stuck in the same routine. Levi made me feel special, like my life was exciting again. It was stupid. I know that now. Her words stung like a slap to the face. So what? You just decided to throw away our life for some cheap thrill? Tears filled her eyes, but she pressed on. It wasn't supposed to go that far. It started with texts, then lunch meetings, and then more. I tried to stop Jameson. I really did. But every time I ended it, he'd come back, and I let it happen. I clenched my jaw, struggling to keep my voice steady. And when he died, was that the first time it hit you how much damage you'd done? She looked down at her coffee, her voice barely audible. The accident shook me. He was driving back from seeing me when it happened. I felt responsible, so guilty. And then I thought about you, about the kids, about everything I'd done, and I couldn't face it. That's why I left. Her confession hit me like a punch in the gut. Levi hadn't just been her lover. He died because of their affair. I leaned back in my seat, staring at her. You know you've destroyed us, right? Yes, she whispered. And I'll do anything to fix it, Jameson. Therapy, counseling, anything. I love you, I always have. Don't, I snapped. Don't say you love me. You don't cheat on someone you love for 5 years. You don't destroy your family because you're bored. She broke down crying, but I couldn't muster any sympathy. Here's how this is going to work, Carmen, I said, my voice cold and steady. I'm moving forward with the divorce. You can stay involved in the kids' lives, but this us is over. Jameson, please, she begged. I'll do whatever it takes. I shook my head. You've already done enough. That night, I sat Richard and Ella down to explain what was happening. I didn't sugarcoat it, but I kept it simple. Your mom and I are getting a divorce, I told them. But that doesn't change how much we both love you. We're still a family, just a different kind. Richard nodded stiffly, his jaw tight. Ella, on the other hand, started crying and threw herself into my arms. I don't want you to split up, she sobbed. I held her close, stroking her hair. I know, sweetie, I know, but this is what's best for all of us. The next day, I met with my lawyer to finalize the paperwork. Carmen hadn't contested anything yet, which made the process smoother. When I left the office, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. Driving home, I thought about everything Carmen had confessed, about the wreckage she'd left behind. Still hurt, and I knew it would for a long time. But for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could see a way forward. Not with her, but with Richard, with Ella, and with a future I could rebuild on my own terms. The day Carmen officially moved out felt surreal. She arrived in the morning with her sister to pack up the rest of her things. Ella clung to her desperately, sobbing and begging her not to leave. I'll see you all the time, sweetheart, Carmen said, kneeling to hug her tightly. This isn't goodbye, I promise. Ella sniffled, clutching her stuffed bunny. But why can't you stay here? Carmen shot me a helpless glance, and I stepped in. Your mom and I have talked about this a lot, I said gently. She's going to stay at Aunt Beatrix's for a while, so we can all have a little space. But she'll still see you, just like always. It was the truth. Well, part of it. I wasn't about to tell Ella that her mom moving out wasn't just about needing space. Richard stayed upstairs the entire time, refusing to come down. When Carmen called his name, he shouted back, "Don't bother." Carmen flinched at his words but didn't try again. She hugged Ella tightly one last time, then glanced at me. "I'll call to set up a time to see them," she said quietly before stepping out the door. When the door closed, the silence was overwhelming. Ella cried into my chest, her small body shaking, while Richard finally came downstairs, standing in the hallway with his arms crossed. "So, she's really gone, huh?" he said, his voice flat. "Yeah," I replied, meeting his gaze. "She's gone." Later that evening, after Ella had gone to bed, Richard and I sat out on the back patio. I had the grill going, flipping burgers when he finally broke the silence. "I still don't get why she did it," he said, his eyes fixed on the flickering flames. "Why she ruined everything." I set the spatula down and leaned against the counter, trying to find the right words. "I don't think I'll ever fully understand it either," I admitted. "But sometimes people make bad choices, and those choices hurt the people they love." Richard scoffed. "Yeah, well, she sure wasn't thinking about us when she made those choices." "No, she wasn't," I agreed. "And that's not okay. But we can't change what she did. All we can do is figure out how to move forward." He glanced at me, his expression softening just a little. "You're handling this way better than I would." I let out a short laugh. "Trust me, bud. I'm just faking it most of the time. You and Ella. That's what keeps me going." For the first time in weeks, Richard gave me a small smile. "Thanks, Dad." In the days that followed, I worked on rebuilding a sense of normalcy for the kids. We went to the park, had movie nights on the couch, and I even got Richard to teach Ella how to play catch. Watching them laugh and tease each other gave me a glimmer of hope. We weren't the same, but we were still a family. One Saturday, I decided to take the kids to a local farmer's market. Ella loved looking at the flowers and homemade soaps, while Richard acted like he was too cool to care, though I caught him sneaking bites of the free samples when he thought no one was watching. As we passed a stand selling fresh pies, someone called out, Hey, you've got a good eye for apples. I turned to see a woman about my age wearing a denim jacket and a friendly smile. She nodded toward the pie I was holding. That one's my favorite, she said. Caramel apple is the best. Oh yeah, I said, trying not to sound awkward. I'll take your word for it. She chuckled. Trust me, you won't regret it. I'm Alice, by the way. Jameson, I replied. And these are my kids, Richard and Ella. Alice waved at them, and Ella waved back enthusiastically. Richard, predictably, just nodded. We chatted for a few minutes about pies, kids, and the controlled chaos of farmers' markets. It wasn't anything profound, but it was nice. Easy. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like I was carrying the weight of the world on my shoulders. As we walked away, Ella tugged on my arm. She was nice, Dad. Yeah, I said, smiling down at her. She was. That night, after the kids were in bed, I sat on the couch with a beer in hand, staring out the window. Life wasn't perfect, far from it. But for the first time, I felt like maybe, just maybe, things were going to be okay.